Well, no, I'm going to make it more complicated. Because it is a complicated story, this Emancipation Proclamation. There's no moment at all in it where it's straightforward, where it's a thing which just happens and then it's over. No, it was a long time in the making. It was a long time in the construction. It had a crooked path to follow. And of course, we continue to experience its repercussions even today. I got interested in the Emancipation Proclamation almost from the other end. Because the question that nagged me was why it was there in the first place. Why it had to be at all. Because when you reflect upon it, Abraham Lincoln had no compelling political movement that was pushing him toward emancipation. Oh, there were abolitionists. There was Lloyd Garrison. There was Frederick Douglass. There was Wendell Phillips. And when you counted all of them up, you might have just about enough fingers to measure their political impact. There was no widespread upswell of movement toward emancipation that would have a political benefit for Lincoln. What did Lincoln, as a politician, have to gain by emancipating slaves? The answer is really not much. Not much. Not much because slavery, looked at from the point of view of 1861, slavery had been customary in almost every human society from time out of mind. Why should the American society all of a sudden get all worked up about it? And then American society itself was dominated by theories of white supremacy. And whites felt no particular compunction to see slaves emancipated. Oh, in the North, they might oppose slavery as an institution, and they might not want slavery to trench on their neighborhoods, their cities, their states, but there was no particular desire on the part of whites to see that taken the next step to actual emancipation. Oh no, that was a very different category indeed. And blacks themselves, even free blacks in the North, of course, had no political leverage. Many places, most places, they didn't even have the vote. Not only did they not have the vote, they could not send their children to the schools for which they were nevertheless taxed to support. They could not serve on juries. They could not give testimony against a white person. No, there was no political leverage there. So why? What moves Abraham Lincoln to take this contrarian step when everything in the political winds seemed to blow in the other direction? There was certainly no compelling military motivation. If anything, he was warned over and over again that if he made any movement toward emancipation, his own armies would throw down their weapons and go home. For they would never fight for emancipation. Restore the Union, yes. Suppress rebellion, yes. But fight for emancipation? No. No. And then Lincoln himself, it has to be said, was never exactly what you would call someone on the cutting edge of agitation for massive racial change in America. If Lincoln had never issued the Emancipation Proclamation, would anyone have noticed? If he had never taken that step, would anyone have blamed him among his peers in 1861 to 1865? And yet he did. He did. And that is the first great conundrum of the Emancipation Proclamation. And that is, with every possible convincing political reason not to do it, he did it. Why? Why? And then the other big question that comes here is, did it make any difference when he did it? Did the Emancipation Proclamation, did this document, 3 pages worth, Did these three pieces of paper make any difference? Did they actually do anything? Or was this a political gesture? Was he trying to impress somebody? Was he trying to ward off the influence and intervention of foreign powers? Was he trying to placate agitators? Was this just something he was going to use as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the rebellious Confederates? Well, Lincoln's own view, as it's captured in the Emancipation Proclamation, frequently disappoints people because they read the Emancipation Proclamation. They read this from the pen of a man who wrote 77 years ago, who wrote malice toward none, charity for all, and they pick up the Emancipation Proclamation, and what do they read? Whereas, on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit. Memorize the Gettysburg Address? Sure. Anybody like to memorize this? No, there's no aria. All right? There's no sing to it. And people look at that and they say, well, you know, that didn't have any substance to it. This from a man who could put zing into words. Now he writes the Emancipation Proclamation. Why is it so absent? And then they read further and they discover that it's limited. You know, here he's talking about this person will be thenceforward and forever free, except in certain places, to wit, St. Bernard, Plaquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension Parish, Assumption, Terrebonne, LaForge, St. Mary, St. Martin, Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, on and on and on we go. But wait a minute. Why are you freeing some people but not freeing other people just because they don't happen to live in a neighborhood that you don't seem to like all that much? And then the rationale for this document, the rationale is that he is doing this as a military necessity. A military necessity. In other words, I wouldn't do this under any other circumstances because confound it, now I've been forced into it by this wretched military situation in this wretched civil war. So, all right, well, fine, I'm going to free the slaves. Yeah, it really sounds enthusiastic. And yet he called it the great act of the 19th century and the great central deed of my administration. These 3 pages were more violently denounced than any other presidential document that has ever been issued. And yet at the same time also more enthusiastically hailed by more people than any other presidential document. Well, it was true. Lincoln was not the most enthusiastic advocate of black civil rights. But he did believe in the equality that every human being has in the enjoyment of their natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He did believe in the equality of those natural rights, and therefore he could not believe in slavery, and he said he hated slavery for as long as he could remember. Not only that, but he had been planning emancipation. He understood that his election in 1860 was the death knell of slavery. That once a president, an anti-slavery president, could be elected, then that was the end of the influence of the slave power. And at that point, a tide had turned and the future was going to see the eventual extinction of slavery. Not that there were not obstacles, though. Here's the crooked path. Because slavery is legal in states. It's a matter of state jurisdictions, not the federal government. Lincoln is only, understand the sense in which I mean this, Lincoln is only the President of the United States. He cannot reach over that wall between state and federal jurisdictions as it existed then to do anything. He couldn't have changed a speed limit if they'd had speed limits. Much less tamper with what was on the state books as a matter of property ownership. He couldn't have done that. That would have been unconstitutional. And if unconstitutional, then the very next place that would have gone would have been right into the federal court system. And who sat at the very top of the federal court system when Lincoln was president? Roger Brooke Tawney, that champion of black rights. Imagine what Roger Tawney would do to a document like this. He would just sit there sharpening his pencils, waiting for it, so that he could put a lead stake through the heart of emancipation for good and for all, the same way he tried to do with the Dred Scott decision. So Lincoln has to walk this crooked path. The only place where the federal government has immediate jurisdiction over slavery is in the District of Columbia. April of 1862, Congress passes District Emancipation and Consent. But that only touches how many people? How many people? A very small speck of the entire population in bondage in this country. He then takes a second step. He invigilates the legislature of the state of Delaware. Delaware is a slave state. It only has 1,700 slaves in it. It's loyal to the Union, but it's a slave state. He invigilates their state legislature with a buyout plan. I will give you $900,000 in federal bonds if you will adopt an emancipation program and do it as the state legislature. That way Tawney and the federal courts will never get their hands on it. $900,000 was a lot of money in those days. They threw it back in his face. They threw it back in his face because whatever else they were white racists. And they simply could not let go of slavery. And that trumped all the money they could get for them. And then he has to walk the path that must take him around his own army, his own generals. The generals who have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, who are plotting a coup d'etat the moment he will issue an emancipation proclamation. People ask me what I think the most dangerous moments of the Civil War were. Were they at Gettysburg? I say, no. Were they in the wilderness? No. They were in that small window of time between the Battle of Antietam and the 8th of October, 1862, when McClellan's officers were laying plans to march on Washington and depose the Lincoln administration. And when McClellan himself, it was feared, was putting himself at their head. I mean, if there's one thing that'll give you second thoughts about issuing an Emancipation Proclamation, it's having your own army mutiny against you for doing it. And then, of course, there was the courts. Oh, the wonderful courts. We think of the courts today, we think of Thurgood Marshall. Well, don't think of Thurgood Marshall in the courts in the 1860s. Think of Roger Tawney. These were the obstacles that he had to negotiate. And he tried every way to move through those obstacles. And every tool for emancipation broke in his hands. Until finally, he decides he must take a different path, the riskiest path of all. He will issue an Emancipation Proclamation as a presidential war powers document. War powers.